Actually, two people drew me to Princeton University. The first was the amazingly wonderful Ruth Simmons. And Ruth Simmons and I were graduate students together at Harvard in the early 70s. She in French, I was in history. I knew her, and we didn't actually keep in close touch after we graduated. But I did know that she'd been an academic, she'd been a scholar for a while, and then it turned out that she was really gifted as an administrator, because she has this wonderful touch of being in touch with people, knowing everything, and then having a sense of her power and how to use it. She's absolutely amazing. So it was mostly thanks to Ruth Simmons. I actually had 2 job offers at the time, and I accepted the one at Johns Hopkins because I thought it would be a better place for me as a publishing scholar. And I accepted that job, and at Hopkins they said, well, just wait a sec. And Toni Morrison called me, and Toni Morrison said, Nell Painter, I will be personally devastated if you do not come to Princeton. So I came to Princeton. That's how I got to Princeton. And I will add that my appointments have always been in history departments. My first job was at Penn, where I was tenured and promoted in 3 years. And my next job was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I was a full professor in 3 years. That is to say, but at all those times, I have always been associated with African American studies and with women's studies. So I was officially in a department, history, but I always cared deeply about African American studies and women's studies. I need to be really careful with my experience at Princeton, because when I first think about it, I get all whiny and aggrieved. When I think back on Princeton, I think about being trivialized and denigrated by my history colleagues, who clearly assumed that I was nobody, somebody taken off the street to teach African American history. Not at all my experience. And I think about the years that we spent, especially, I'm thinking of Noliwe Rooks and I as partners, trying to build a professoriate of color, trying to build a department that had some power. And it just felt like knocking our heads against the wall. It was really a devastating experience. And one of the happiest moments in my life was learning that African American Studies was finally a department. And I've been just delighted by the scholars and the work and the visibility and the students. African American Studies has just turned out beautifully at Princeton. But when I think about myself at Princeton, I don't want to talk about it. The obstacles were the habits of white supremacy, the assumptions of white supremacy, the assumptions that scholars of color didn't have anything useful to say or to teach. Interestingly enough, some of the departments, like sociology, for instance, and English, were interested in people we wanted to hire, but Nassau Hall put obstacles in the way. And it was heartbreaking. One of my fondest is my lost struggle over a painting by the wonderful Robert Colescott, which only I thought was hilariously funny and wonderful. The students or the colleagues didn't agree with me and kept putting it behind the couch. But more than that, it was knowing that we were providing useful knowledge to students, to the world, to Princeton generally. And I have felt over the years that the useful knowledge of African American studies has paid off tremendously in providing the intellectual ballast of understanding the world we live in, the country we live in, and its history. That has been a great payoff for me. When I think about the department today, I think since I live in Newark, I've lived in Newark since 2002, so I'm not right there. I see African American studies at Princeton from its world facing, the way it is Princeton African American studies and the world. And it is beautifully there in books, in articles, in reportage, that the people of African American studies and the knowledge of African American studies at Princeton are in the world. When I left Princeton, I went to art school. I finished the book I was working on, The History of White People, which was a 10 years program for me. And it came out in my first year of graduate school, art graduate school. So I mostly finished the actual writing when I was an art undergraduate at Mason Gross School of the Arts, and I graduated in 2009. And in 2010, The History of White People came out in the spring of my first year of painting MFA at the Rhode Island School of Design. And I don't recommend to anyone that you combine graduate school, especially a graduate school in the arts, with a book that became a New York Times bestseller. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. I went on the Colbert Report. It was very visible, and I did all my work. I did all my work for graduate school, but I did a lot of work. And then after I graduated from RISD in 2011, I did a year's arts residency at a Faro Gallery here in Newark. And Newark has a wonderful community of artists. Newark is an artist city. Even our mayor is a poet and the son of a poet, son of Amiri Baraka. So I started in 2011, 2012 with the artist residency at a Faro. And then in 2012, moved to the studio I have today in the Ironbound, a nice, great big studio. And I have been making a lot of art and showing a lot of art. I've had artist residencies at MacDowell, Lanyadoo, and UCross and Bogliasco, and showing my art. I also continue to write. So in 2021, the second edition of my book, Southern History Across the Color Line, came out. And right now I am finishing up an edition of my historical essays called I Just Keep Talking. And that's for Doubleday. And then right after that, it's already contracted. I'm writing a new biography of Sojourner Truth. A quarter of a century ago, I published a scholarly biography of Sojourner Truth that gave you all the things you needed to know, like, no, she did not say, ain't I or aren't I a woman? A white woman journalist made that up 12 years after the fact. But now, with Penguin Random House, I am doing a book called, with the working title, A Personal Biography of Sojourner Truth. And I just learned something that will go into that personal biography, is that the state of New York is putting together a Sojourner Truth State Park in Kingston, right along the Hudson River, where she grew up and where she worked and lived. So I will go there, and my sense of being in the Sojourner Truth State Park will be part of that personal biography of Sojourner Truth. Oh gosh, that's really hard. And it's like when you have children, it's like the one you had last, most recently, is kind of the one that you love. Right now, I'm preparing to go to a 2-week residency at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to a printmaking studio. And I love printmaking. And my project is a series of, what I've done is a series of drawings that will become one print or one print project, which I call the William Still book. William Still was the head, was the head of the Vigilance Committee in the 1850s in Philadelphia. And people who were emancipating themselves from enslavement would come through, and he kept a notebook of the names of the people and where they were coming from and who had claimed them before. It's a heart-wrenching book. And one of the things, 2 things that I noticed as I read this, the first was people were leaving at an amazing clip. People were leaving once a week, practically. The slavery system was hemorrhaging at the time. And the other thing is that right as they got to Philadelphia, they would change their names. They would take new names. That was also very heartwarming. So that's the program right now. And so, of course, it's my favorite right now. Yeah, I have lived a long life, and I grew up in the age of segregation. Even though I lived in California, I grew up in the age of segregation. And the ceiling was very low. I felt around 1968 or so that things were opening up with civil rights. And at that point, I came to feel that I could write American history, that people would read. I mean, I knew that there was a lot of American history that people had written. African American scholars had written, like John Hope Franklin or W.E.B. Du Bois, but that was kind of known knowledge within my family and my community. It wasn't city knowledge, world knowledge, country knowledge. But by 68, I started feeling like I could write American history. And that's when I went to graduate school at Harvard. But since about 2000, maybe it's 2008 with Obama, 2010, around there, but certainly since 2020, since the George Floyd summer, there has been an opening that made me say to my husband and myself, I'm so glad I didn't die young, because I feel like people can hear me and people can hear you and people can hear the knowledge of African American studies in a way that wasn't possible before. I am not a wildly ambitious person, but I have always wanted my work to be seen and to be read. And I feel like now, in this newer world, that is possible.